All right, so we got some pretty major updates here in the aftermath of Saudi Arabia and OPEC Plus deciding to slash their oil output, basically as a double middle finger to Joe Biden in the United States, who did that trip to meet with Mohammed bin Salman and basically got on his hands and knees and begged him to release more into the global markets in order to try to tamp down gas prices here domestically. And it seems like there is definitely a little bit of pressure that is building, even across party lines, in order to try to reevaluate or reimagine the U.S. relationship with this country. So here from Common Dreams, Jake Johnson, he says, Khanna and Blumenthal propose bill to immediately halt all U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Okay, first of all, based as fuck, there's sort of like a two-pronged approach that has been proposed by different members of Congress. You have this version of it, which is basically saying, as it says in the title, to halt the arms sales to Saudi Arabia. We've been selling them tens of billions of dollars over the last number of years. And basically, as I've covered on this channel before, the United States, along with the United Kingdom, are virtually unilaterally propping up the entirety of the Saudi Air Force. So, I mean, if we wanted to, tomorrow we could basically shut that off. It's also not just in the weapons that we are giving them. It's the continued logistical support, the military intelligence support that we are giving them in order to maintain their Air Force and maintain all of the planes and all of that shit. So this act, if it was actually passed and Joe Biden decided he was in favor of taking this step, would definitely be a significant blow to Saudi Arabia. And they would probably have to go and, get their military hardware from some other country, probably Russia. Although, with the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, good luck trying to get the, weapons that we have been giving them. But let's get into some of the details here. They say Representative Khanna announced on Sunday that he is teaming up with Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal on a bill to block all U.S. weapon sales to Saudi Arabia in response to the Saudi-led OPEC's newly announced decision to slash oil production, driving up gas prices across the globe. So a couple of different things here. First of all, we should be halting our weapon sales to Saudi Arabia, point blank period, regardless of whether or not they are slightly more amenable to our oil interests. This is a country which is, again, a brutal dictatorship. Just saw a story just a couple days ago. They're doing more and more beheadings. I think Mohammed bin Salman actually ordered the beheadings of some of his own family members. So, I mean, this is an incredibly brutal, repressive, theocratic regime that we're talking about here. They dismember journalists like the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. They are continuing to do an ongoing, essentially, genocide in Yemen. So, not exactly the type of people who we should be allying with if we want to simultaneously pretend like we care about human rights and democracy and freedom of speech and values like that, right? So I don't think that we should be giving them the weapons regardless, but if this is an excuse to actually bring this relationship to an end, then I'm all for it. Now, another point that I think needs to be made here is that, you could definitely make an argument that Saudi Arabia, one of the biggest oil producers in the world, along with Russia, which is of course part of OPEC Plus, them drawing down the amount that they are releasing into the global markets, that definitely has some effect in terms of the supply cost that is then going to be passed on to U.S. consumers, but it's definitely not the only effect, right? I mean, we know for a fact that U.S. multinational fossil fuel corporations like Chevron and Exxon and a lot of other companies as well, like Shell and BP, they have all been seeing record profits. And how have they been seeing record profits? Well, it's not because, there was an increase in the cost of oil on the global market, and so they had, supply side costs that they had to pass on to consumers, and that's why we've been having high gas prices. No, they've been making billions of dollars in excess profits, historically record profits for them, off the backs of American consumers. They have been price gouging us. So it's not even just a problem with whether or not this oil cartel based in Saudi Arabia, which is the main, country that is leading this cartel, it's not just about them increasing their oil output. It's also about tackling the fact that we have, many Republicans and Democrats who come out and call gas prices and oil prices a national security risk, while simultaneously allowing the gas prices here, the oil prices on the international market, to be determined by cartels and private for-profit corporations whose goal is not to provide cheap gas to the American people, it's to extract as much profits as they physically can and legally can off of the backs of the American people. So, I mean, you have to confront that in a two-pronged way, in my opinion. You could definitely do something like price caps, you could do a windfall profits tax, something to actually address the problem that a lot of these corporations are facing in terms of driving up our gas prices here domestically. But They continue saying in an op-ed for Politico, Ro Khanna from California and Blumenthal from Connecticut and Yale School of Management professor Jeffrey Sonnenfeld argued that OPEC and Russia's move to cut oil production by 2 million barrels per day starting in November will, quote, worsen global inflation, undermine successful efforts in the U.S. to bring down the price of gas, and help fuel Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Now, another point here in terms of like how Saudi Arabia is helping Russia in this overall equation, right? So not only are they fucking us on the global market by increasing or reducing the supply in order to drive up the cost of oil on the market, not only are they fucking us on the back end on that front, but they're also going behind the scenes and buying Russian oil for a discounted price, right, because of the situation with the war, because of Western Europe's hesitancy to use Russian energy. They're getting a basically a ridiculously good deal on the energy that they are importing from Russia and using that domestically, and then shipping their own oil that they are producing within their own country to countries like the United States at an elevated premium. Okay, so they're sort of like fucking us on the front end and also helping Russia on the back end. So I think that that's definitely a fair critique to say that this is them sort of throwing a bone to Vladimir Putin, but they continue saying that the Saudi decision was a pointed blow to the U.S., but the U.S. also has a way to respond. It can promptly pause the massive transfer of American warfare technology into the eager hands of the Saudis, the trio wrote. That is why we are proposing bicameral legislation in the Senate and the House on Tuesday that will immediately halt all U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia. They say for several years now, our colleagues have been considering similar proposals, but those measures haven't passed, they added, due to the intense bipartisan blowback to Saudi's collusion with Russia. We think this time is different. Based on our conversations with colleagues, our legislation is already garnering bipartisan support in both chambers, so that's kind of promising. There was that bill that passed. I think it was also led by Ro Khanna a couple years ago to basically halt U.S. support for the ongoing Saudi-led genocide in Yemen, and of course Donald Trump being the violent imperialist that he is, and somebody who is definitely buddy-buddy with MBS and the Saudi regime that's in power right now, he actually ended up vetoing that. So I definitely think that there could be legitimate bipartisan support for this type of a bill. I think a large part of that will maybe depend on whether or not Joe Biden is actually willing to come out and go to bat for this, but they continue saying that according to one estimate, just a little background in terms of our relationship with this country, the U.S. agreed to sell roughly $64.1 billion worth of weapons, averaging over $10 billion a year to Saudi Arabia between 2015 and 2020. $10 billion a year we are giving them to go use these weapons against the people of Yemen, massacring innocent civilians, continuing to prop them up diplomatically while they massacre journalists and, incredibly brutally repress their own population. And then on top of that, a lot of the weapons that we give them, a lot of the weapons that Saudi Arabia possesses because of the United States also go into the international black market and are given into the hands of terrorists. Saudi Arabia is one of the greatest exports of terrorists in the region, and some of those weapons end up being turned on like U.S. soldiers. So like the idea that we are still giving them these billions of dollars of weapons with no accountability whatsoever for even things that directly negatively affect our own national security, it's like this doesn't even make sense from the perspective of like the U.S. empire, right? Even if you want to take that sort of a view on this, it doesn't even make sense under that branch, because the whole idea of this relationship is that we give them these weapons, we sacrifice any credibility on human rights, on freedom of speech, on any of the values that we pretend to care about, democracy, right? We sacrifice that because they're going to help us with our oil prices, but they're not even doing that. I mean, they've demonstrated over and over and over again, they're not a reliable partner even on that front. So it's like, this doesn't even make sense under their own, fucked up justification in terms of why we should just discard the human rights abuses and the genocide and all of that shit. They're still not even helping us on the back end. So of course, this is like the most logical thing that you could possibly do. I mean, this is a dumb moment right here, but they continue saying that the arms sales to the Saudis, the largest purchaser of U.S. weaponry, have continued under the Biden administration despite its pledges to end the war on Yemen and render the oil kingdom a pariah over its assassination of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. So, of course, we've talked about this before. Joe Biden obviously promised on the campaign trail, just a straight-up bald-faced lie, said he was going to turn them into a pariah state, he was going to end the war in Yemen. He's done absolutely nothing on any of those fronts. Said he was going to hold them accountable for Jamal Khashoggi. He's done fucking fucking nothing, okay? And he's done really the opposite of nothing because, with his recent trip and with his continued diplomatic support, really he's just been propping them up to continue doing exactly what they're doing, right? So definitely a complete walk back and a reversal 180 on what he was talking about on the campaign trail. Now, Khanna and Blumenthal weren't the only people who were coming out and speaking on this. We also had the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman, Senator Menendez, and this is important because this guy actually has like legitimate power to wield in this moment in terms of determining whether or not we continue with this weapons relationship with Saudi Arabia. And he said the United States must immediately freeze all aspects of our cooperation with Saudi Arabia, including any arms sales and security cooperation beyond what is absolutely necessary to defend U.S. personnel and interests. So obviously, this end part here, beyond what is absolutely necessary to defend U.S. personnel and interests, that's a pretty big loophole, right? That's pretty vague. What exactly do you mean by U.S. personnel? What exactly do you mean by U.S. interests? I mean, that's a pretty big loophole that he's throwing in this statement. But I mean, the idea that we're in a situation right now where, you have so many people across even some bipartisan lines who are coming out and recognizing that this relationship needs to fundamentally change, I think that that's absolutely going to be a positive thing. Now, a lot of this, again, is going to depend on what Joe Brandon wants to do. So here from the New York Times, they say Biden is apparently open to reevaluating the relationship with Saudi Arabia after the oil production cuts. So what are they talking about here? They say President Biden is reevaluating the relationship with Saudi Arabia after it teamed up with Russia to cut oil production in a move that bolstered Vladimir Putin's government and could raise American gasoline prices just before the midterm elections, a White House official said on Tuesday. And keep in mind, okay, this isn't conspiratorial. Mohammed bin Salman, Russia, OPEC Plus, they understand that, the Republican Party, especially with Donald Trump at the helm, somebody who's taken billions of dollars from them, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, took that $2 billion investment from the Saudis, incredible amounts of corruption throughout his presidency with his hotels involving the Saudis. I mean, so many different angles that you could look at in terms of the Republican, but mostly like the Trump family and their circle connections to Saudi Arabia. Definitely understand that Saudi Arabia knows that they want the Republican Party back in power. They want Donald Trump to win in 2024. So there's definitely a political angle here in terms of part of their motivation to doing this beyond just their own economic benefits here. But they got a quote here from John F. Kirby speaking on behalf of the Biden administration. He says, "I think the president's been very clear that this is a relationship that we need to continue to reevaluate, that we need to be willing to revisit." Very vague there. The official John F. Kirby, the strategic communications coordinator for the National Security Council at the White House, said on CNN. And certainly in light of the OPEC decision, I think that that's where he is. So again, I mean, this is pretty vague shit that we're talking about here. There's definitely not a commitment from the Joe Biden administration to actually take aggressive steps on this. Now, again, there's two main things that are on the table right now. You have halting all U.S. arms sales and military cooperation with the Saudis. And then you also have this other thing that has been sort of floated by some Democratic members of the House and Senate as well, which would be to apply antitrust laws to international organizations like OPEC Plus. And that would also be an absolutely great move, right? Because you would be applying a lot of these rules that are supposed to be typically used to break up like monopoly power, and especially with a literal oil cartel like OPEC Plus, that could definitely be an effective measure in order to combat some of the power that they have on the global oil markets as well as over the United States energy system. So, I mean, listen, at the end of the day, just in a broad sense, obviously, again, Saudi Arabia is not an ally of ours. They've never behaved as an ally of ours. They shouldn't be considered an ally of ours, not just because of the human rights abuses, the war crimes, all of that shit. Of course, that would be in and of itself enough to cut our ties with this country. But then beyond that, they're not even fulfilling their purpose as like a client state of the United States and, delivering that sweet, cheap oil to us on the global market. So it's like there's no angle you could possibly look at this relationship and think that it needs to continue, right? This is nothing but a net negative for the United States, any type of way that you want to look at it. And beyond that, obviously, you have to make the point that, when a lot of people come out and they talk about, especially Republicans, talking about energy independence and making the United States like the energy powerhouse of the world. Well, energy independence doesn't just mean independence from needing to import from other countries like Russia and import from other countries like, whatever it's Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iran, any of these different countries. That's not what energy independence would truly mean. Energy independence would be nationalizing our energy system, right? It would be making sure sure that our energy system, our oil prices, our gas prices here domestically are not in large part dictated by for-profit corporations who are making record profits off of the backs of price gouging the American consumers, okay? That would be one way to actually be energy independent. But beyond that, the main way you can become truly energy independent is to just not be reliant on fossil fuels in the first place, and to aggressively transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy, so that we do have a lot more sustainability within our domestic output. I mean, we could be investing in wind and solar and also nuclear technology as well, which is something that a lot of people overlook in this conversation as well, in terms of moving away from fossil fuel usage. So that's where our investments should be going. We should be moving away from this for-profit model within our energy systems. We should be nationalizing them, treating it, if you truly believe that it is a national security issue, then act like it, right? Nationalize our energy system and use that power, use that revenue that you get from that in order to aggressively transition away from fossil fuels in the first place and towards renewable energy. And then, you wouldn't not only be dependent on these, fossil fuel corporations, but you would also not be dependent on fossil fuels in the first place, and also not be propping up incredibly brutal and authoritarian dictators around the world.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying